In this edition of the Red and Blue Political Roundup, President Trump is defending himself against accusations that he dodged nearly $500 million in taxes. A New York Times investigation claims the president was involved in multiple instances of tax fraud. They include allegedly decreasing the reportable value of gifts from his parents during the 1990s. The report also states President Trump received hundreds of millions of dollars in real estate holdings from his father. That contradicts the president's narrative of being a self-made billionaire. The New York State Tax Department is reportedly reviewing the allegations. The president denied the claims in a statement made by his personal attorney Tuesday. Chris Cadelago joins me now from our Washington bureau. He's a White House reporter for Politico. Chris, thanks for being with us. What's the reaction inside the White House to these allegations in the New York Times report?
The thing that really stood out to us is the fact that when this piece landed, almost immediately we were hearing from folks inside the White House that had this been another publication, it may not have had the same effect it is having with the president. But this is the New York Times. This is a paper that he holds in sort of the highest esteem. He said last week at a UN press conference that this is a paper he once loved. And so the fact that this is in the New York Times, and also, as you mentioned, that this really sort of blows up the narrative that Donald Trump is a self-made man and that he built everything on his own. And so the combination of those two things, I think, are really going to get under his skin. And I know he's preparing to speak pretty soon, and we do expect him to talk about, as he calls it, the failing New York Times.
Right. And, you know, Chris, it's one thing to read about it also online. It's another when that paper gets delivered. This article, when you print it out, it's 38 pages long. It's quite substantial. So the president's lawyer, as we mentioned, released a statement in response Tuesday. He said that if the Times states or implies the president participated in a crime, it will be, quote, exposing itself to substantial liability and damages for defamation. Is there any indication at all, Chris, that the president's personal attorneys are gearing up for another legal fight here?
I think it's unclear. We know all the media that Donald Trump has threatened to or has sued over the course of his career. But I think in this case, you know, if you read down into the story, they do talk about how many of these things, there's some very strident language in there about fraud and about breaking the law. But they also say that these things happened so long ago that we are probably well outside of the statute of limitation. And so the question is it a debate about fraud that may have happened that could be defamatory? It doesn't look like there will be legal repercussions on the part of the state.
Yeah, although it does, correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, I believe it does talk about the fact that there is still the possibility of civil penalties.
There are civil penalties, and a lot of people have pointed out the fact that this was largely talking about what happened in the 90s and prior to that. And the question is, now we know there are a lot of investigations going on, including the Mueller probe. So is anyone looking at the business post this time, and did any of these sorts of tax practices continue? And that's a big question looking forward.
Certainly. Let's turn to the Kavanaugh confirmation. The president responded to the Kavanaugh investigation Tuesday, and of course that generated some controversy. Let's listen to some of what he had to say.
Well, I say that it's a very scary time for young men in America when you can be guilty of something that you may not be guilty of. This is a very difficult time. What's happening here has much more to do than even the appointment of a Supreme Court justice. It really does. You could be somebody that was perfect your entire life, and somebody could accuse you of something. Doesn't necessarily have to be a woman, as everybody says, but somebody could accuse you of something, and you're automatically guilty.
Really interesting to listen to that, Chris. Are White House staffers concerned that that kind of language from the president could alienate certain groups of voters?
What you hear a lot from the White House's political side is the fact that they are very, very focused on the president's base. And I think these comments from the president today echo what we've heard from a lot of his allies, including his son, Don Jr., who has said that, he feared for his sons possibly more than his daughter. This is something that we're hearing from the president's supporters. The idea that folks could sort of rein him in or get him back on script, I think we're well past that, especially as he's out there now rallying. And the idea is that Donald Trump has said last week that he personally experienced people coming and making wrongful charges. And we know that Donald Trump views a lot of these things that happen to people within his inner circle and his administration through the prism of what happened to him. And so nobody is going to change his mind about people out there making false allegations and how it could harm your character because, again, these are things that he believes happened to him, and he's going to express himself about it.
So your organization, Politico, is reporting that Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell is concentrating all his efforts on the, quote, gang of three. Remind us who these key swing votes are and what are Republicans doing behind the scenes to try to win them over?
Sure. I would step back even more and I would say as things were happening with Kavanaugh and as the president was reacting and Republicans were reacting, we were reminded over and over by folks working on the confirmation inside the White House that we need to focus on Senator from Arizona, Jeff Flake, the Senator from Maine, Susan Collins, and the Senator from Alaska, Lisa Murkowski, and that those are really going to be the key audience that Brett Kavanaugh was playing to in his confirmation and that the White House is focused on. What Trump says about his nominee is important, but how these senators understand this FBI investigation that's going on, what they're able to conclude from it, and how they view Brett Kavanaugh in the end is really what this all comes down to. And we see both Senator Mitch McConnell now and the White House tailoring their messages and their approaches to these senators because no matter what anyone else says, these are the votes that they need, and these are people who have come out and said they need to feel comfortable with their vote for Brett Kavanaugh before they cast it.
Well, as you know, Republican Senator Lindsey Graham said Tuesday the president should renominate Kavanaugh if the vote fails. How realistic is that, and do we know of any preparations being made by the White House if he is not confirmed?
The White House has really resisted talking about a plan B, and part of that is timing. It's unlikely that anyone would be able to get through. We're talking 60 to 90 days from start to finish for a confirmation. So really, they sort of harm themselves by talking about the possibility of bringing in one of these other potential nominees that were on the short list before, or talking about even renominating Brett Kavanaugh. I think what Lindsey Graham is doing is really trying to focus on the fact that this is their guy. This is the person they want on the court. It's a way to sort of rally behind him and also a way to signal again to the White House, as he did clearly in his speech from the dais last week, that he is out there fighting for them and he's sort of their number one defender in the Senate.
Well, Senate Judiciary Committee Chairman Chuck Grassley announced Tuesday that the FBI report will not be made public, so senators are going to receive the FBI reports, copies of them. Is there concern from the White House, though, that the results will, in fact, eventually be leaked?
I don't know. I think the White House feels like this report needs to be done first and foremost, and I think they feel like when this information is concluded that they're not necessarily concerned with what it might bring up, and they think that it'll actually be a positive thing, as the president said, because they feel like it'll clear Brett Kavanaugh. What this has done, of course, is sparked across the aisle dissent from the Democrats who clearly have now another sticking point that they could latch on to. We've also heard from some of the accusers as of late in the afternoon, including Dr. Christine Blasey Ford, coming out and saying, hey, I haven't even been contacted yet by the FBI. So this idea that this investigation will completely clear Brett Kavanaugh, I think, is going to reach a lot of pushback on the Democratic side and from critics who are saying, it's happening too quickly or it's just not thorough enough.
On another topic, Chris, the president's former campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, met with the special counsel Monday. He's being questioned about Russian interference in the 2016 election. Where does the probe stand currently? Do we know? And do you have a sense if the White House is concerned about what Manafort may be telling investigators?
I think it's completely unclear, given what's happened in the first trial for Paul Manafort and now the delay before the second one, what he might know. We have heard over and over from the president's personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, that Paul Manafort won't share anything because, quote, he has nothing to share. And so they have remained confident in that sense. But, of course, because the scope of that investigation, the timing of that investigation, so little about it is known and so little of it has sort of leaked out of Mueller's side, I think that there are folks that are still clearly worried about where that might go and the tentacles that might reach. And I think, again, today's New York Times story sort of shows the possibility. I mean, there's any number of issues, from financial issues involving the president or his family, that this could go to. So it's impossible to know right now. And there are multiple people within the president's former or current orbit who have either already sort of flipped to Mueller or are contemplating it. So it's a precarious time.
Yeah. Well, finally, the United States, Mexico, and Canada finalized a trade agreement Sunday. The president has said it's not NAFTA redone, it's a brand new deal. Is this considered a political victory for the president?
He would put this under the category of his promises made, promises kept campaign banner. Folks who, they believe that Democrats will see things in here that they will support. The question is this going to pass Congress, and when? There are still a lot of, the criticism, I guess, would be that this is sort of a new coat of paint on an old building and a classic Donald Trump move where he takes something, tinkers with it a little bit, modernizes it, and then puts a new name on it, as he's done. They're not calling it the new NAFTA. There's another acronym that they're using. And so, I think across the board, this is getting some laudatory comments. Trump's administration is coming out. It gives them something to rally around and talk about in terms of success, even though it's not completely finalized and approved.
All right. A busy day in Washington. I don't know how you do it. Chris Cadelago, thanks so much, Chris. Really